Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm Justin Bassey.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Liv, we're back with another TSD Summit Sessions today, and it's a double header this week for our listeners. We had Dave working very, very hard around the Sydney Dialogue given the high quality of the attendees.
That's right, Justin, and I'm personally very excited about today's episode. Selina Xu, who leads China and AI research and strategic initiatives in the Office of Eric Schmidt, joins Dave to discuss China's progress in AI capabilities and adoption.
Yeah, they discussed China's AI progress in relation to the US and how the tech is being adopted and integrated across China, the effectiveness of China's AI Plus directive, and their focus on integrating AI into the economy, as well as China's ongoing limitations in relation to compute.
They also discussed the different perspectives on AI in the US and China, and whether the US is too focused on achieving AGI, at the expense of enabling AI adoption and integration across the globe as a supplier of choice.
It's a timely conversation, particularly given this week, Liv, we've just read the Financial Times reporting.
Dave's favourite paper.
It is Dave's favourite. Now I think Politico might have pipped them. But yes, the Financial Times reported that currently the top 10 or the 10 top ranked open source AI models are almost all Chinese. Simultaneously, Eric Schmidt has warned that US companies risk ceding open source AI to China completely. It doesn't necessarily mean that China's going to win the AI race, but China's open source approach has helped it make rapid progress on AI and has forced US companies to rethink their closed approaches. And if anyone is interested in examining the US and China research investment into these areas and that of other nations, don't hesitate to check out ASPI's Critical Tech Tracker, which looks at all these issues in great detail.
Selina and Dave spent a bit of time talking about the open source issue, why it not only helped China develop the tech, but also allowed it to become a provider of choice for many countries, including the Global South.
It really is a great conversation, and Selina is very, very impressive. So it's over to Selina and Dave.
Welcome to the Stop the World Summit Sessions, folks. I'm here with Selina Xu. Selina, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So you're an expert. You've written widely on Chinese tech and Chinese tech capabilities. Let's start with an overview. I mean, particularly on AI, that's a obvious area of interest. How do you assess Chinese AI capabilities at the moment, say relative to the US? How are their priorities different? Where are there particular areas of strength and perhaps weakness?
Yeah, it's a very close race. I think a lot has changed over the past year. Last year, most people, the general consensus was like China's AI progress was about 2 to 3 years behind the US. Mm-hmm. And that generally means say OpenAI releases a model, it takes a Chinese company about, a long period of time to be able to replicate that and do something of a similar capability or performance on a benchmark. That really changed with DeepSeek. OpenAI released a reasoning model, O1, and in about 3 months, DeepSeek released R1, which was basically a comparable reasoning model. So that's how small the gap has been. It's become about like a matter of weeks or months instead of a matter of years. So it's hard to say because a lot of the best US AI models are closed, meaning that they're proprietary. You can access them on like their app or like through API, but you kind of don't know how good they are. So I think it's kind of speculative if the same thing is happening on the Chinese side. Maybe some companies like ByteDance also have closed models. But I think the general consensus is that China is about a matter of maybe like 3 to 12 months behind the US. And if you're looking at specific types of models, so for open source, which is very easy to track and basically benchmark, Chinese models are the best open source models right now. So it used to be Meta's Llama. Now it's very much dominated by models like DeepSeek, Alibaba's QN, Moonshot's Kimi, and a bunch of others. So it's become a very saturated space, but very much just dominated by Chinese companies.
Interesting. I want to come back to open source as a strength or the relative merits of open versus closed source. But first, just on that's on their capabilities on frontier models. But what about other areas like integration, adoption, application? How is China doing on that relative to the US? And what does it say, I guess, about where their priorities lie?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a lot of the narrative has been about an AGI race. And I think one thing that has really changed this year is that people are starting to realize that China is not just blindly pursuing AGI in the way that Silicon Valley is, but it's doing a very different kind of approach. So essentially racing in its own lane instead of just replicating what the Bay Area companies are doing. So China has basically tried to really push for diffusion. You can see this from the huge AI Plus directive that was issued a couple months back, which essentially pushed for all kinds of adoption across different sectors, from industrial transformation to governance to scientific discovery to all kinds of stuff like consumer applications. So it's like a whole range of things. And by pushing for adoption, I think the government priority is very much trying to increase productivity, boost the GDP. They're seeing AI as like the new economic driver after you've seen a bunch of old drivers lag, like real estate and stuff like that. So I think this is very much where the Chinese government mindset is. It's about using AI for actual economic gain and like very real world impact in the very near term. So it could be possible that maybe Xi Jinping is AI pilled and he's thinking about AGI ultimately. But right now, if you look at public documents, where the local governments are acting, what the ministry directives are, it's very much about like, hey, we want adoption. And one of the big ones that was released just a couple of weeks ago was by the MIIT, Ministry of like Industrial and Information Tech. So they essentially pushed for more stuff to do with AI and manufacturing. And this is one area in which China knows it's a manufacturing powerhouse, and they want AI to turbocharge that. So that could be things like robotics arms they're doing assembling. It could be AI being used in like inspection and quality control. It could be like AI used in spatial design. So a lot of integration of AI into traditional sectors to try to push manufacturing output and make this more efficient. So that's kind of what the Chinese government is thinking.
And I've read a lot of commentary saying that could actually be the smarter way to approach this at the moment, putting your effort primarily into that, practical adoption, strengthening your economy, improving your productivity, especially in areas that are, well, I suppose where it complements and boosts your areas of advantage, like manufacturing in the case of China. In fact, I think it was your piece with Eric in the New York Times was the first time I sort of saw that argument being made. But what's your view? And I guess what is the emerging predominant view among commentators and experts about the relative merits of those competing priorities? I mean, is the US just sort of, excessively focused on achieving AGI, potentially at the expense of putting effort into these other areas that might actually win the day in the long run?
Yeah, it's unclear. So I think what we kind of argued for in our piece in the New York Times was very much, we think that there should be a combination of both.
Yeah.
Because you don't really know, like, what if AGI, it ends up happening in the near term. I think people generally think it's going to happen maybe within the next 10 years. But I think it's unclear how soon and, what kind of explosion exactly it is. So I think, yes, do pursue that. But on the other hand, it's worth acknowledging what China is doing and seeing, hey, why are they doing this different approach? And I think it's very much driven by economic realities, but also I think it's very pragmatic. I think part of the AI discourse is, the underlying thing is philosophical. A lot of the AI discourse in the US is undergirded by this tradition of transhumanism, of thinking of AI as machine god. And a lot of it's about AI safety and effective altruism, all of that. The Chinese discourse has been very instrumentalist because of Marxism, probably, historical materialism. So people think of AI as a tool, and they want it to basically improve their lives because that's kind of the technological reality they've lived in over the past 40 years of technology just being a tool that really improved the conditions of life. So I think that's kind of the different mentality that kind of drives the different approaches. And it's worth thinking of, hey, if we want the public to be enthusiastic about AI, if we want AI to not be a bubble and to be actually something that's, widespread, improves people's lives and brings about abundance, you kind of do need that optimism and that kind of practical adoption to come, right? Not to say that we don't want the final recursive self-improvement, huge growth. that can come later. But I think to try to both use the AI that we currently have now to do, small and narrow models that can actually be practically impactful in like specific fields like healthcare or education, and then also pursue the very like foundational models that can probably drive that kind of explosion that people who are feeling the AGI are envisioning.
That's real. I mean, I see some fascinating implications around that philosophical difference. I suppose, the CCP's long-running social contract with the Chinese people is that, we will run a sort of, an authoritarian system, and in return, we guarantee that we will steward a strong economy that will grow and provide you with a improved, quality of standard of living, basically. And so integrating AI into that to improve economic output fits very well with that sort of, I guess, that promise they have made to the Chinese people. At the same time, the CCP loves control. And I mean, how likely do you think it is that the CCP might actually have some kind of resistance, hesitation about approaching AGI because, there are so obviously significant questions about the ability to control it?
Yeah, I think they've been very hesitant, like in the past few years. So when ChatGPT came out, a lot of the Chinese regulation around AI was very much focused on control. It was, housed under the Cyberspace Administration, the CAC, where essentially most of the regulation around deepfakes, like synthetic media, was about like, hey, we have to make sure that, the misinformation that really plagued Western social media doesn't happen in China with AI. So that was kind of the approach. And then this year, things started to change because I think, one, they saw the huge market impact that DeepSeek had on the US market. So that was one. Two, there was a huge boost to the Chinese stock market, in particular like the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong. They were like, whoa, like people are really like hyped about AI. And like, just to put it into context, like Chinese stock markets have been like absolutely terrible over the past few years throughout COVID. It's been pretty much stagnant, very few IPOs. It's like consumer sentiment is really down, and that's been a huge focus for the CCP because they want to boost consumption, So I think they saw the incredible impact of DeepSeek and how AI could essentially maybe become a new boost to the economy. And that's kind of resulted in a pivot in like this government attitude towards like, one, they've become, more supportive of open source. Now they're like, hey, open source is a national strategy. We want to boost open source. They even said, one of the bullet points in like the AI Plus directive was saying like, hey, if you do open source contributions as a student or faculty, that can count towards your credit. So, they're really trying to push for that. So one was open source. And then second, there's been a lot more, trying to integrate AI into the economy and getting more of the AI policy decisions to go to the NDRC, which is basically the economic planning body, instead of, in the past, it was very much the internet regulator. So you can see like, with the gravity of policy making shifting towards like, the economic planning body, you can kind of see, the Chinese government is basically thinking of, hey, we now want AI to be something that's more about the economy than just regulation. But I do think it's a pendulum that swings. So right now it's that, but you can see if there is like any kind of, incident in which AI causes some kind of social instability, I can see the pendulum swinging very fast back. And the CCP I think is better poised than like the US government or a lot of other governments to really just clamp down on that, because everything is so controlled, right? Like the whole information environment. So I think this pendulum will swing. And yes, I totally agree with you. CCP is very focused on regime stability. So I think part of the understanding of AI right now is like, hey, we like it because it's good for the economy. But the moment it is something that's, causes instability, I think it will swing right back and they will clamp down.
Right. Okay. So, I'm going to come in a moment to that question of open source and, I guess a sort of national strategy that China might have. But one last one on AGI, and that is, I suppose, this idea of a race, of a sort of AI race potentially having a finishing line might make some sense. And this is the strategic boffin in me talking. But if it were the case that one country or one lab might actually reach AGI, and it is so powerful that you could only be 6 weeks or 3 months ahead, but it is so powerful that it becomes a kind of a super weapon, superpower that you can use offensively and neutralize the other countries' AI development. And you might even be able to do it through some kind of like incredibly subtle cyber attacks that, suddenly all of their data isn't making any sense anymore and they can't figure out why. I mean, it could be like they might even not realize they're being attacked. It's, the AGI is, becomes so smart so quickly that that's probably a bit of an unlikely sci-fi scenario. But I suppose, I don't know, do you see that factoring into the thinking in any sense? I mean, you mentioned before that, your piece with Eric was arguing that they should be doing both because obviously AGI, it is still a real prospect. And if it happens soon and if it happens in a sort of fast takeoff type scenario, then it could actually be a kind of a winner takes all outcome. I mean, how do you see that kind of factoring into the competing visions for AI?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think anything's possible, right? When you're speculating about AI, which is so uncertain in terms of like the final outcome and what scenario that will look like. If you look at currently what China is doing, I think they're very limited by some practical constraints in chips, which essentially means that they can't scale towards AGI in the way that the Bay Area companies can. And like if you look at the capex spending on like AI data centers with all the like GPUs, it's 1/10 of what the US is doing, right? So if you look at public spending, you look at the kind of compute they have, even if they smuggle chips across borders, it's been very small amounts. They can't. If that is the path to AGI, which is what I think the current, most of the frontier labs are still sticking to that approach, then China simply can't reach AGI in that way. They could try to do, a more efficiency-focused approach, which is what DeepSeek is doing with like mixture of experts and stuff like that, and like sparse attention. So I think that's what DeepSeek is trying to do, but it's unclear if we're following the scaling paradigm, if the chips constraint remains the same, if China can even reach AGI at all. So I think that's one thing, which is if, say, AGI is the finishing line, with all conditions constant, unclear if China can even reach it. Then what is the race then? Or like what is a lot of the scenarios that when people talk about like, hey, it's going to be like mutual assured destruction, China will want to bomb our stuff, whatever, like the data centers. I think that's kind of unlikely in the current scenario. So that's one. I think the second thing is that like the question of if AGI will be reached by the best frontier models, then how easy is it for China to steal the model weights? And right now it's pretty like there's not much being done to prevent China from doing that. And they're kind of not, like by current evidence, China isn't doing that because they feel like they're quite close behind. Or maybe it's because the Chinese government doesn't think, they're not AGI pilled yet. So I think those are all the things that you can see right now in the current climate. And right now we're not heading towards this like, it's not clear to me that China believes in this winner takes all, AGI as the finishing line narrative for now. But like that can change, right?
So why do you think it would be relatively easy for them to steal those weights if they wanted to? Is that a cybersecurity thing? Is it a human security thing from employees within the US labs? How do you think that might, or a combination of all these things?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but right now, based on people I've talked to, like model theft is not something that people are actively working to prevent, or like the current like technical barrier is very easily overcome by any state actor. I think that's what I've heard. I don't know the technical details of that, but like I think that's not where a lot of the whole like how do we make AI secure and safe like resources have been put into, right? Most of that has been put into other stuff, but not into this aspect.
I mean, certainly anecdotally, what you're saying, tracks with what we hear. I think there was, one of the sort of renegade former OpenAI employees who spoke publicly afterwards said that, as far as he was concerned, Chinese, cyber spies had been inside OpenAI from, right from day one. Ben Horowitz, the other half, the less voluble half of Andreessen Horowitz, although he's been doing a lot of podcasts recently, I think, said something I was listening to last week. He said he was arguing for open source and why the US should be pursuing open source much more enthusiastically. And one of his points was, that China has access to all of our models if they really want it. Then they've got access to it. So anyway, what you're saying certainly tracks. All right, well, let's get on to open source and I suppose the competitive and strategic advantages of that, and in the way that China's approaching it. And DeepSeek obviously was a big moment in that sense. Notwithstanding, I find the economics of open source to be a little bit baffling. I still don't quite understand why it's a great idea, especially when the US labs are, they're trying to get their revenues to climb up to a point where they can remotely start to make sense of the huge investments that are going into their compute. But leaving that aside for a moment, I guess tell me about the impact that DeepSeek has had on China's ability to diffuse and to gain market share for DeepSeek particularly, but subsequent Chinese models that have also been open source. What has that meant for its uptake around the world?
Yeah, DeepSeek has essentially been like a catfish effect, I think, on the Chinese AI ecosystem. Before DeepSeek, a lot of the major players were all closed, including like Baidu, Moonshot, and stuff like that. After DeepSeek, practically all the Chinese companies have released some sort of AI, open source AI model, with the exception of like ByteDance for some of its main Doubao model, but it's open source some of its other like video generation or like AI agents models. So I think DeepSeek essentially made Chinese companies realize, hey, the open source is actually a great way to, level the playing field. You learn very fast from your competitors, meaning you don't have to replicate efforts or like waste excess resources. That's one. Two, you can attract talent who actually want to gain prestige and like publish, and like that's actually a huge thing. I think a lot of the AI game is being determined by like the caliber of talent. And then three, I think DeepSeek kind of showed people that open source is a great way to gain, an international reputation and really just like attract users, enthusiasm. And I think that's kind of basically accelerated the whole series of open source releases from China, which has basically been like one every few weeks, or actually multiple probably. So that's what's happened. The economics of open source is murky, just like, some people talked about like the economics of AI itself, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the problem with open source is that it's unclear like how you're going to monetize. People have talked about like, like for instance, Alibaba has kind of been trying to pursue something like, hey, if more people use our open source QN models, maybe they'll want to use our entire stack, including like our cloud services. That's one. DeepSeek, because it's been such a national champion, Huawei's tech stack, they basically offer like, you can get a lot of free DeepSeek within a certain amount of tokens. So there's been that. And, some of the other companies are thinking, hey, maybe if people use our open source models, they will interact and give us feedback and, like our models more, and maybe, use other services that we offer that can actually be monetizable. So that's kind of the different tracks that people are trying to do. But right now, like nobody's seeing a profit, right? It seems like a very long road to very small profit, which I think all the Chinese companies are concerned about, but it's not clear right now. And so much of the pressure is about staying alive that, open sourcing just seems like a way to show investors that, hey, we have so much global enthusiasm. And so far it's worked. So I think that's kind of what the companies are thinking about. But in terms of diffusion, I think the very big thing is just a matter of like cost, right? So for most of the like countries in the global south, if you're like a scrappy developer, you're trying to build a startup, you can't afford like OpenAI's API costs. Or even if you can, if you compare DeepSeek's latest API cost, it's about like 96% cheaper than ChatGPT. So it's incredible. Like if you're thinking about the economics of that, do you want the best frontier model for 10x the price or 100x the price? Or do you want a good enough model that might be, second or third tier, but it's so much cheaper? And for a lot of applications, you don't actually need the best frontier model. So I think that's the kind of approach that Chinese companies are trying to do right now. And it sounds very similar to like the playbook for like, smartphones,
Totally.
EVs, solar panels, right? Yep. And like maybe that will play out again in AI and in robotics. But it's very much like, hey, we are gonna just like drive down the prices and, that's bad for everybody. Yeah. But, at the end of the day, if like the last one standing is like a Chinese company, great.
It's not at all an unfair conclusion to jump to that they are repeating what they have done previously with other technologies, right? I mean, it's open source it, basically give it away for free, lock a whole bunch of particularly global South countries in, and, you are then the sort of, the primary provider for those for that technology for those countries. It's a soft power thing. It's all sorts of brings all sorts of advantages. And if the Chinese sort of national tolerance for accepting some long-term economic loss from that in the interests of a longer-term strategic gain, that sort of tracks with what we've seen from them in the past.
Totally. Like, I think you're totally right. It's very much about soft power, right? Like when the Trump admin talks about like we want people to use the U.S. tech stack. Like, what is that? Like, why is it good if someone in Africa uses ChatGPT? It's very much about influence, right? Yep. And like there's a bit about like norms and values, of course, but like it's a soft power play. And then for China in particular, totally right. I think open source has also been interestingly good for domestic adoption. So a lot of the state-owned enterprises, their AI adoption, and also like smaller companies within China, they've been it's easier for people to adopt when you have an open source model. So now that's kind of, what's happening, and it's very convenient, I think, for the CCP because a lot of the narrative around, hey, global South countries use our open source models it matches with what they're talking about when they say AI for good, bridging the AI divide. We want to, help you and make sure you have access, right? So I mean, there's like part of it's messaging, and then part of it is like, hey, it could be good economically in the long run.
Right. Okay. Where does this leave us in terms of the pros and cons of things like chip exports then, do you think? Let's just cover that for a moment, because I think it's obviously an important, a much debated part of the equation. I mean, I've always felt that, whatever the arguments around, China still managed to come up with a really strong, whatever mixture of experts model, despite having some severely constrained access to the most advanced chips. I can't imagine that any country on the world would say, okay, we'd rather have fewer advanced chips. I mean, imagine if they had the great algorithms, the great talent, and the chips on top of that. You'd have to think they'd be way out in advance. But I suppose when we're thinking about the quality of the AI product still comes down to, everyone talks about the triad of data, talent, which equates to algorithms and compute. Is compute the one area where, at least for the time being, the US still has a significant advantage that it ought to try and hold on to? Where do you come down on that?
Yeah. I think yes, in the sense that like Chinese companies, the Chinese government, China is just limited by compute. And obviously no one will say no to compute, like no country in the world. It may very well be that if they had more compute, they would not be pursuing these kinds of, efficiency-focused approaches at all, So I definitely think that compute is the biggest bottleneck for China's AI development in the near term. But the separate question is on export controls is whether should the US keep maintaining its export controls or reinforce them, or at this point does it still matter? And I think it's kind of like the Chinese industry has kind of passed the Rubicon on this.
Right.
It's the point of no return. Essentially, there is no way that if today the Trump admin says, we'll sell you the best Nvidia Blackwell chips, China is not going to be like, let's stop developing Huawei and SMIC and everything. I think the sense that I've heard from people on the ground is that like China is all in on its domestic semiconductor industry, on a lot of the policies about like no foreign chips being used in its state-owned enterprises, data centers, things like encouraging domestic companies to use domestic chips instead of like Nvidia chips. All of that's going to stay, like regardless. I think at this point it's very much about like, you know, before the export controls, all Chinese companies loved Nvidia GPUs. I think now the reason that some of them are like, fine, we'll migrate away despite all the great things about Nvidia, including like the CUDA, I think is very much because it's been so like unstable. When you're trying to pre-train an LLM, it's like a long cycle. You don't want to have to keep switching your chips or like changing your approach. So I think at this point, the Chinese domestic chips have gotten to the point where they're like maybe good enough when you stack a lot of them together, but they're extremely energy intensive.
Right.
But you know, it can actually kind of work.
Yep.
So I think now that migration has really started to happen, and even if you relent on like export controls, China's not going back. Like
Right.
that's the sense I get.
Right. Okay. It was an epic bit of trolling when Nvidia finally got permission to sell H20s, and China went, yeah, no thanks, we don't want them anymore.
And that could be a bit of posturing. Right?
Sure. I've no doubt. I mean, it was.
But actually, yeah, like that's the kind of directive they've given to the industry.
Yep. And I suppose yes, they might be more energy intensive, but at the same time, I mean, China's got energy for days. I mean, they're building every form of energy, nuclear, coal, renewables all at the same time, right? So that, I mean, they can actually afford that energy, that energy boost. Let's finish off with this question of whether sort of, laying down the infrastructure around the world somehow sort of confers an ability to set rules of the road, to set norms, to set values. This always feels like a slightly sort of fuzzy argument to me. I mean, we hear it quite a lot, but I wonder, how does that actually translate into some sort of practical gain for the country that is gaining that is getting a market share advantage? So if I'm selling to to Africa or Southeast Asia, my the essential elements of my tech stack, do you think it actually enables me to I suppose to define what is and isn't sort of like acceptable norms around the use of AI? I suppose it comes down to should we be worried about the exporting of an authoritarian Chinese style approach to AI through the infrastructure export?
Yeah, it's not clear to me either.
Okay.
Like, I think the quibble I have with the whole authoritarian values thing with open source models is that you can basically fine tune them in post training and remove those things, which is what like I think some American companies like Perplexity, like AI, they did. So I think for now, if the thing that China is exporting is open source models, like that doesn't seem to match the whole like authoritarian values, kind of thing. But yeah, like the value of having your tech stack being used globally, I mean, one is very much about economics, right? Like if this boosts the market cap of your companies, that's good. This maybe confers, some kind of influence in the way Belt and Road did for like, fiscal infrastructure.
So a soft power thing like we were talking about before. Yep.
Yeah, but it is unclear if it's, like maybe at the end of the day, it is about like hearts and minds, and it's very much about like whose vision of the future do people find more compelling, right? And I think so much of the Cold War, or like all kinds of like geopolitical stuff is about that, right? Like in the past, everybody found like American modernity and like what emerged from Silicon Valley as like this is the future, and then there's been a bit of a like tidal shift. And that now people are like going to China and feeling like, oh my God, I'm seeing the future when I see the robots, the digital payments. And so I think that is the ultimate vision that, the like US and China are battling over. And AI is just one part of it. There's so much more beyond just like data centers, chips, chatbots, LMs. A lot of it's also a lot of other things, right? Like energy, like renewable energy, robotics, very physical AI, and other things like, I don't know, smartphones and whatever, and like the next generation AI enabled hardware. So I think there is this very holistic thing that's happening, and it's important to like look just beyond what's happening, at the level of like, the model benchmarks and all the others. And I think it's going to be about like, hey, like if this is the vision of the future that like seems stronger and more salient, like from China instead of from Silicon Valley, then I think that's really gonna like hurt the whole sense of like American exceptionalism, everything else, like the techno optimism, like all of that we've kind of taken for granted for the past century. That of course America is the one that like makes the future. Sure. Of course the future emerges first, right? In America. So I think that's kind of the larger thing at stake, which when people talk about like, oh my God, tech stack, or we want countries to use our stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I feel very, very strongly about democratic systems over authoritarian ones, it's hard for me to feel much moral outrage if they are simply making good stuff that is affordable and accessible to countries that are perhaps strategically more neutral than Australia might be, for instance. So anyway, with that, wonderful chat, Selina, and thank you so much for coming to Sydney for the Sydney Dialogue. Your session yesterday was an absolute standout. So we'll be putting those up on YouTube in due course. But I'm certainly going to urge all of our viewers to check out Selina's session from the Sydney Dialogue yesterday.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for the great questions.
Thanks for listening to Stop the World. If you want more regular updates on what's happening in the cyber and tech space, don't forget to register to ASPI's Daily Cyber and Tech Digest.